Good evening, everyone. My name is Tammy Navarro, and I am the Associate Director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women. I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening to our book salon in honor of BCRW's director, Tina Campt. Tina has written an important new book, Listening to Images, and we are thrilled that this salon is our first event of this semester. The format of the book salon, bringing together an author with their peers and interlocutors, is one we have used at BCRW for the past few years with incredible success. We hosted the inaugural salon in the spring of 2011 that was inspired and driven by the scholarship of Lauren Berlant. In the years since, we have hosted salons honoring Carla F.C. Holloway, Tanika Sarkar, Janet Mock, Christina Crosby, Maggie Nelson, and most recently, Christina Sharp. So just a word on format. We'll start tonight's salon with a reading by Tina from Listening to Images, followed by responses from each of our panelists. Saidiya Hartman will moderate a conversation based on these responses, followed by some Q&A from the audience. So while Saidiya will introduce the panelists, it is my pleasure briefly to introduce her now. Saidiya Hartman is a professor of English and comparative literature and women's and gender studies at Columbia University. Professor Hartman's major fields of interest are African American and American literature and cultural history, slavery, law and literature, and performance studies. She's the author of Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th Century America, and Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route. She is currently completing a new book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. Please join me in welcoming Professor Saidiya Hartman.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. So it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Tina Campt, who has been a friend, a collaborator, a co-teacher, and colleague for over a decade. She is the author of Other Germans, Black Germans and the Politics of Race, Gender, and Memory in the Third Reich, a much celebrated book written at the intersection of disparate fields: German history, African diaspora studies, critical race theory, feminist theory, and Holocaust studies. Other Germans examines the contradictions and differentiations of the racial policy of the Third Reich, contributing to our understanding of comparative racialization, but never falling prey to the lure of analogy. Through close attention to narratives of memory that produce knowledge of the past, Campt engages memory texts. Campt engages memory texts. See, I lost the bios for later, so they're just returning them to me now. Okay, so Campt engages memory texts and the formal operations of narrative as distillations of historical and social experience. The silence and indirection found within these memory texts articulate the specific character of National Socialism as experienced and endured by Black Germans, and illuminate the marginalization and othering which was particular to the non-systemic persecution of Afro-Germans. Image Matters, Archive, Photography, and the African Diaspora builds upon Campt's previous work, but extends it in the direction of visual studies. The book examines vernacular photographs and studio portraits of Afro-Germans and Black British identity in the interwar and post-war years in order to examine the fashioning of diasporic and national identity in family pictures and individual portraits. Campt attends to the performative and indexical character of these images and details the ways in which photographs perform national belonging and announce the centrality of Black Europeans to the landscape of everyday life in Germany and their successful assimilation in Britain. What Campt discovers looking through this photographic archive is surprisingly that photographic images represent Black Europeans as integrated members of the social fabric of these societies in spite of the discrimination and exclusion they experience. Here in Image Matters, she first develops the idea of the haptic image, that is, object whose effects are structured by a tripartite sense of touch, an indexical touch, a physical touch, and an affective touch. It is a touch that suffuses both the composition of the image and our response to it. They are images touched by the subjects they capture, touched by those who view or encounter them, yet objects that also touch those who view them as well. End quote. These corporeal modes of apprehending the photograph encompass touching and listening, as well as looking and watching. This multisensory engagement with the image reverses or topples the relation of mastery, hierarchy, and isolation that usually characterizes optical viewing. In reading the serial images of Black West Indian migrants of the Windrush generation, Campt engages the photograph as it is cut and augmented by sound, and considers sound as a constitutive supplement to how we read images. This strategy of looking and listening yields an understanding of these serial portraits as musical images that convey an aspirational harmonics of Sunday best. In Campt's hands, vernacular, studio, and compelled images represent and sound the richness of Black sociality and the dissonant strains of refusal. Whether looking at an orphan photograph of an unnamed Black girl on the examination table or mugshots of Black prisoners in Cape Colony, Campt finds a way into the image and a way of looking that allows for, quote, the possibility, if not of agency, resistance, or opposition, then, most important, of fugitivity. Affective kinship, seriality, hapticality, felt sound, and fugitivity are the set of key terms that connect image matters and listening to images. In listening to images, Campt expands the discussion of fugitivity by way of the quotidian practice of refusal. Quote, like the concept of fugitivity, practicing refusal highlights the tense relations between acts of flight and escape and creative practices of refusal, nimble and strategic practices that undermine the categories of the dominant. The refusal to stay put or stay in a designated place, and the refusal of the very premises that have reduced the lived experience of Blackness to one of pathology is what Campt discerns in the quiet and compelled images of the captive and the colonized, and as well in the archive of self-portraits posted on Tumblr that anticipate, inhabit, and refuse premature death. Listening to images, too, refuses this anticipated death and its embrace and imagining of futurity, by which Campt means the future interior sense of the now. It is at the heart of Black feminist practice and the effort to think and imagine, quote, beyond current fact and to envision that which is not but must be. The grammar of Black feminist futurity, Campt writes, is a politics of prefiguration that involves living the future now as imperative rather than subjunctive, as a striving for the future you want to see right now in the present. On these words, let's welcome Tina Campt.
First of all, thank you so much, everyone, for coming out this evening. Thank you so much, Saidiya Hartman, for that amazing introduction. I have never quite grasped, having witnessed several of these salons, how humbling they are for the person whose work is being showcased or celebrated. And I'm truly humbled now. So I need to begin by explaining that humility with a few words of thanks. That humility comes from the fact that looking at this panel and looking at this audience, there are so many people in the room who enabled me to think this work to the end. We all know that writing, research, scholarship is a collaborative venture fundamentally, but I can see in every row at least 2 to 5 people who held my hand through this process and inspired me through their work, through their encouragement, through their critique, to think harder, to think better, to think in more complex ways. So it is a deep, deep pleasure to be able to share the product with this community of thinkers who really did contribute to creating this collaborative work. The other thing I want to say about this is that it is such a challenge to actually try and do a sliver of a reading. And Tammy was absolutely right. I refer to this as my little book. And it was a luxury to be able to actually think one thought to the end. And so what I want to do is try and give you a slice of that thought rather than a kind of overview of that thought. And so what I'm going to be reading are some excerpts that try and enact the practice of listening to images that I aspire to. And that practice is one of lingering and attending to photographs in all their complexity. And trying not necessarily to hear something in them, and not necessarily to see something in them, but to look beyond what we see, to be able to engage that which we have to inhabit in order to understand them. So what are their quiet frequencies of a particular genre of images? Elaborately scripted or stoically labeled for utility, adorned with gold leaf or lacking all embellishment, leaves of heavy paper or yellowing parchment bound between covers of leather or cardboard. Photographic albums vary from ornate to monastically austere. Images affixed with adhesive or anchored in place by delicate photo corners. Their arrangement is a meticulous study in memory and narrative. The photo album is an indisputably haptic repository of recollection. Haptics, or the multiple forms of contact and touch that characterize any photo, any encounter with a photo album, commence the moments we feel their weight, open their pages, or inhale the musty smell of worn, aged, or deteriorating paper, plastic, or hide. They touch us as we run fingers or palms over glossy squares of paper, albumen, or metal prints carefully positioned and inscribed with sentimental notations, dates, and places. But do all albums catalyze such affects? And do they catalyze them in the same way? This album and the photos it contains were neither held nor caressed by their sitters or their loved ones. They enjoyed no haptic relationship to it, for they never had access to or possession of the images that reside on its pages. The album was not made for public or private display for the friends or family of those imaged within it. Dated 1893, its provenance is announced by the label that appears partially ripped on its cover: Prisons, Convict Department, Church Square. It is an album of prisoner photographs from the Breakwater Prison in South Africa, an artifact brought to my attention by a remarkable archivist named Erica LaRue at the Western Cape Archives in Cape Town, South Africa. Convict photos are a genre of identification photography that Susanna Regna describes as compelled photos, images taken without the permission of their subjects. Assembled here, however, they are a haptic archive of recollection, albeit one constituted in the service of the state. Measuring approximately 24 by 36 inches and encompassing 16 images per page, these albums share the haptic materiality of similarly weighty tones that we engage through embodied encounters with the senses: the physical touch of hands, the olfactory touch of smell, and the forms of institutional memory each instantiates. Some men are shaven and shorn, as if to reveal features that might have been hidden or disguised by excessive facial hair, or perhaps more practically for reasons of hygiene. Yet these images also show signs of aging in their photographic subjects. And differences in lighting suggest a temporal difference. Running gloved hands gently over the surface of the photos reveals that unlike most of the others, although displayed side by side in the album, these are distinct images, shot in different sittings. In other images, men lean into the camera as if directed to give a fuller view of the ear, a Darwinian hallmark and one of the most significant body parts in Bertillon's physiognomic arsenal. The prominent display of the ear is a gruesome echo that links the mugshot to the passport photo. For even today, the rules of passport photography in many places continue to require the display of the ear. And then there is the showing of hands. Hands uniformly placed upon uniforms themselves. The positioning of these hands is more than purposeful. It is both prescribed as well as literally transcribed onto the uniforms themselves, where we often see painted white marks that seem to indicate exactly where these hands should be placed. Presented as prominently as the faces, heads, and ears of these captive subjects, hands were scrutinized for distinguishing marks and attributes, carefully documented on intake and used to identify on recapture. Here it bears emphasizing that these are not arrest photos, nor are they photos of individuals suspected, wanted, or sought for crimes not yet prosecuted. They are images created to capture subjects deemed guilty and sentenced to served. They are photographed to facilitate capture in the case of future crimes or possible flight. They were made to provide visual evidence of criminality and incarceration and to telegraphically inscribe that evidence onto the future of their photographic subjects. The grammar of this archive, or this archive, is an anterior tense of present and future capture. And its first haptic temporality is this initial moment of capture. Compelled to pose for a compulsory photo, confronting the unreturnable gaze of the camera, an individual is transformed into a number that will capture him for years to come. A second haptic temporality is initiated by this same moment of photographic capture, the temporality of the image and the album's production. After the physical encounter of the image with the photographer, there is the interval of the production of the image itself, the time lag between the making of the photograph and the creation of the photograph, and the time lag between the making of the images and the assembly of the album. The tense of this haptic temporality resounds in the interiority of the future subjunctive. If you are ever released, you will still be ours. But who made these albums, and where were they constructed? How do we account for the haptic frequencies of this archive? For such an accounting, we must turn to their supplement, the ledgers. Each of the albums held by the Western Cape Archives is supplemented by 3 ledgers: an index, a nominal register, and a descriptive return. What is the relationship between these individuals' photographic capture and the forms of state, carceral, and colonial accounting that occur in these ledgers? Why record this information in 3 separate places? And now I'm going to segue to a different section of the same chapter called the Book of Innocence. It felt a lot like cracking a code. I was convinced I'd solved it several times. I thought this at least once a day for the first 2 weeks of my second visit to the archives, only to return the next day to watch a new pattern emerge from the puzzle. It started with the dates. Inscribed in graceful script below each pairing of photographs were a name and date. In the upper corner, a second inscription was etched by hand. You can kind of see them there. Was etched by hand onto the negative, a letter followed by a series of numbers. But the key to the code lies in the dates, consecutive dates that move forward in time. Although the albums contained photos of Black, brown, and white prisoners, the dates divided them. Each date comprised a set of inmates in groups of varying size, segregated by race. February 1893, 2 Black inmates. February 3rd, 13 inmates. February 5, 16. But the dates did not correspond to the ledgers. They were dates of neither arrest nor sentencing, nor intake nor release. They were dates of photographic capture. Dates when photographers visited the prison to photograph a designated group of inmates. Their sequence was irregular, with no fixed or identifiable interval. But patterns did begin to emerge in the serial numbers, though seeing them required the ledgers, and for this album, one in particular. Its leather spine was stamped in embossed gold letters that read, "Nominal Roll of Convicts." Yet this album was unlike the others. Its excessively worn cover gave it a different name. Burned by hand into its face were 4 unsettling words: the Book of Innocence. Was this an ironic renaming of this ledger by a sarcastic prison administrator? Was it a cynical joke among the prison staff? Regardless of its origin or meaning, and as eerie as it was to encounter in the present, once I read it, I could no longer refer to it in any other way. My archival detective work deepened through the transcription of the Book of Innocence. I traced each Black prisoner in the album to his entry in the ledger and recorded the information contained on him in the ledger. Some inmates had been photographed just days or weeks after sentencing. Others were photographed years or even decades following their conviction. Like each of the other volumes of the nominal rolls, the Book of Innocence was organized alphabetically by serial number. Serial numbers beginning with E were men convicted of lesser crimes, such as theft of stock, housebreaking, store breaking, or theft of money. D indicated individuals convicted of multiple crimes: assault and attempted rape, housebreaking, theft, and murder, attempted rape and escape. Serial numbers starting with B or C corresponded to more serious infractions with heavier sentences: culpable homicide, sodomy, manslaughter, the sentence terms ranging from life to death commuted to life, or 28 years and 75 lashes. The albums had a sensuousness that to me felt almost illicit. It felt wrong to have access to intimate details of bodily marking, illnesses, whippings, closest relatives, attempted and successful escapes. It was overwhelming to track these men from one ledger to the next and resist the seductions of the data and descriptions the albums contained. In fact, it was frustratingly easy to succumb to the original intent of the archive, to reduce these individuals to statistics. And it was literally dizzying to shift back and forth between the 4 tables Erica had assigned to me, on which I had placed the 3 ledgers corresponding to the photos of inmates in each album. As I wheeled myself on a rolling chair from one table to the next to connect each Black or brown face with the compromised details of an identity assigned to him through the categories of the ledger, this haptic encounter forced me to encounter them through a different sensory modality. In an attempt to resist the silencing effect of the serial bureaucratic grammar of the archive. It forced me to attend to the quiet frequencies of austere images that reverberate between images, statistical data, and state practices of social regulation. While each ledger was intended to catalog different forms of information about their sitters, the haptic temporalities of each album archived a physical encounter with an incarcerated subject rendered mute in the pages of the ledger. Each ledger silenced its subjects by drowning them in an excess of data and statistics and the accumulated knowledge the ledgers so relentlessly sought to compile. Yet while the photo albums paradoxically provide the least amount of data, they move the subject from mute to quiet subjects who refuse the silence imposed upon them in the effort to reduce them to a concatenation of criminal statistics. The images visualize the expressive faces of men who, in the lists and tables of the ledger, appear as merely an aggregation of data. The photos render them fleshly individuals with presence and affect. Passive supplicants, no. Stern or mocking in confrontation, frightened, weary, or confused, cocky, or menacing. Cocking or menacing, haggard or hyped, not a single face is docile. Listening to the lower frequencies of these images, what emerges is neither uniformity or statistical equivalence. Rather than an aggregate mass, the seriality of the photos individuates and personifies them. In the process, they become enlivened, improvised impersonations of prisoners. The Book of Innocence Revisited. Both their faces and their demeanor are markedly different. Most notably, they are significantly younger. We might expect to see fragility and vulnerability in these young faces. Rather than fear or confusion, they exude confidence and intention. Uniforms are replaced by dignified button-down collars, suits, and ties, or the feminine outline of blouses and dresses. While these images were produced over half a century later, the pairings of full frontal and profile portraits remain consistent. Serial numbers are transposed from the edge of the frame to black and white boards at the center of the image. While they are not displayed in order, each set contains a series of numbers that reflect the sequential intake of arrest and processing. They are freedom riders. 328 men and women arrested in Mississippi on buses, in stations and parks, or at lunch counters and hotels, and jailed for participating in a 7-month protest campaign begun in May 1961 to desegregate transportation in the US South from Virginia to Texas. Like the Breakwater album, these mugshots were criminal documentation of the breach of peace for which these individuals were detained. They were collated and filed on index cards containing similar data to the Breakwater ledgers: name, height, hair and eye color, race and sex, birthday, birth city, current address. Unlike the albums, this information was affixed to the Freedom Riders' mugshots. While the disciplinary and archival grammar of the Freedom Rider mugshots and the Breakwater prison convict albums are closely related, they are also diverged in at least one way. The criminal archive of the Freedom Riders was made in the temporality of dismantling the racist social order of Jim Crow in the US South and the perceived threat of racial integration that desegregation was seen to pose. In contrast, the Breakwater albums were created in the temporality of establishing racial segregation in the Cape Colony. In this way, the Freedom Rider mugshots and the Breakwater albums archive antithetical moments in the history of racialized dispossession. The year 1961 marked the beginning of the struggle for African American civil rights and the nonviolent tactics of protest and civil disobedience that were deployed by the movement to achieve this goal. While 1893, the year of the photographic capture of the convict photos collected in the first Breakwater album and cataloged for the ledger of the Book of Innocence, marks an equally significant moment of transition in the colonial prison system and racial segregation more broadly in South Africa. Against this backdrop, what becomes increasingly audible at a lower frequency is the intended objective this archival practice sought to accomplish, which is namely the reduction of its photographic subjects to criminals and nothing but or nothing more than criminals. It hums in the background with the persistent rhythm of a work song. Their photographic capture was deployed to accomplish a mode of accounting that purported to produce an end to violence, rebellion, recidivism, and criminality. But the interior grammar of these images guarantee both their fugitivity and the futurity of that fugitivity, as the opposite was in fact the outcome. Both their physical and photographic capture were never intended to be temporary. They were intended to document the transformation of their subjects into a proletarian labor force managed by the penal system and placed at the disposal of industry, capital, and the state. These photos guarantee the futurity of these subjects' fugitivity as instantiations of their perpetual pursuit as once and future criminals and manageable units of labor. Yet like the fugitivity of the Freedom Rider mugshots, the fugitivity of the Breakwater albums is a refusal of those cataloged in their pages to be completely captured or reduced to the archival grammar of criminality or the seriality of type. What emerges through an engagement with the lower frequencies of these quiet photos is the fact that they are at once inseparable from, yet always exceed, the archival and effective technology of criminal photography. For even in their seriality and their supposed interchangeability, are themselves a fiction. And I want to end with a little vignette, which is kind of a coda to what I'm trying to argue about right now, which is what happened at the end of this archival encounter. I'll conclude by posing a counterintuitive question that I posed at the beginning of this same chapter, but it's posed slightly differently. It's a question of counterintuition that motivates my own archival and methodological practice, and which I confront over and over again in relationship to the methodology of listening to images. Why? That question. Why use the sonic and the haptic, the temporal or the grammatical, to understand the affects of photos, particularly photos that can neither speak for themselves nor be seen on their own outside of the visual or discursive lexicon of the state? Why engage the touch of images never meant to be touched and never intended to have an effective life, or the sonic frequencies of images of intentionally muted subjects? As ever, my answer requires another embodied encounter with the visual archive of diaspora. Unbeknownst to me, this photograph was taken by my husband on my final day at the Western Cape Archives at the end of my first visit in December of 2013. It was his first visit to an archive, and I had begged him to accompany because, quite frankly, I was truly desperate. I was desperate because the device on which I had stored all the photographs that I had taken the week before had been stolen. And I was scrambling to rephotograph as many images as possible before returning home the following day. While he diligently photographed, I sorted and selected the most important images of the albums for him to record. And though he said nothing about it at the time, he showed me this photograph on the plane home and described what touched him about these photos. His hands framed the photos of Meyer Gluckman. He was struck by the resemblance between his hands and Meyer's hands, though they don't resemble each other at all. And more specifically, the lack of resemblance between his hands and Meyer's. And more specifically, the lack of resemblance that might be randomly deployed to classify them both as Jews or Hebrews in the idiom of these ledgers, because everybody was categorized according to race, including Jews who were categorized as Hebrews by race. His hands were a link to the arbitrary racialization of a mere show of hands. As he described it, his Jewish hands cradle Meyer's Jewish hands. This image juxtaposes the hands of a Jewish craftsman against the hands of a so-called Jewish criminal. Through this truly touching image and the hands that frame it, the convict photo is transformed into what it sought to distance itself from all along, a family album. Thank you.
I will introduce all of our distinguished panelists. The first respondent is Nicole Fleetwood, who is an associate professor in the Department of American Studies at Rutgers University. She's the author of 2 books, Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness, which was the recipient of the 2012 Laura Romero First Book Publication Prize of the American Studies Association, and also the author of On Racial Icons, Blackness in the Public Imagination. She is the recipient of fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, yay, the Schomburg Center for Research on Black Culture, and the Whiting Foundation. Currently, she is completing her 3rd book, Marking Time, Prison Art and Public Culture, a study of visual art in the era of mass incarceration. The next respondent is Jack Halberstam, is professor of gender studies and English at Columbia University. Halberstam is the author of 5 books, none of which he's named or listed here. Most recently, a short book titled Trans with UC Press, and has written articles that have appeared in numerous journals, magazines, and collections, again vague. Halberstam is currently working on a book titled Wild Thing on queer anarchy, performance, and protest culture, the visual representation of anarchy, and the intersections between animality, the human, and the environment. Deborah Thomas, our last respondent, is professor of anthropology and Africana studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica. Globalization and Race, Transformations in the Cultural Production of Blackness, and with Kamari Maxine Clark. That was with Kamari Maxine Clark, and she's the author of Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica, all books published by Duke University Press. She's also co-director and co-producer of the film Bad Friday, Rastafari After Coral Gardens, and 4 Days in May, and she's the co-curator of a multimedia installation titled Bearing Witness, 4 Days in West Kingston, which will open at the Penn Museum in November 2017. Thank you.
So good evening. I'm going to just sit here because I don't have slides. It's an honor to be here to discuss Tina's work and also to be in such wonderful company. I'm an admirer of all the work here of my fellow panelists and really glad to be in conversation with everyone. So Campt begins listening to images with a throat clearing, followed by a set of questions. How does a Black feminist grapple with a future that hasn't happened but must, while witnessing the mounting disposability of Black lives that don't seem to matter? What constitutes futurity in the shadow of the persistent enactment of premature Black death? The book grows out of and expands on these persistent questions and really starts off by honoring her scholarly legacies through Spillers, Hall, Stuart Hall, and Carby. But she also honors her fellow travelers, Hartman, Moten, Sharp, to name a few. Campt, the multilingual traveler, interdisciplinary scholar, cultural historian, visual theorist, feminist, flanneuse, yogi, traverses across global metropoles, post-industrial wastelands, and exurbs, shaped all by racial capitalism, listening all the while to overlooked, abandoned, historically dismissed photos of Black subjects, photos that span from the 19th century to the contemporary moment. Throughout her journey, she invites the reader to consider what it means to be a scholar and a student, and she is both throughout this journey, of Black feminist studies, cultural studies, and diasporic studies at this historic moment. How might our conventional expectations and interpretations of image limit our capacity to make meaning in and through the images at this moment? And we see her struggle with these questions. To navigate this journey, Campt develops and refines theories of haptic temporalities, sonic frequencies, Black feminist anterior grammar, and these are terms that I'd like us to discuss in more detail during our Q&A, to engage the visual record of the then and now and the future. Her movement through various archives, galleries, and nation states are through a keen awareness. Her movements, are through a keen awareness of self as historic subject who can traverse these spaces and enter institutions, some of which she would not have had access even a few decades ago, especially in South Africa. And this awareness that we experience with her enlightens the archival encounter. We journey with her from her family home where she listened to the hums of her mourning father. They involuntarily erupt from him in the present absence of her deceased mother. His humming carries her forward to Chelsea Galleries, Birmingham Libraries, South African museums and archives, and then back home to family albums and shared missed memories. Early on, she lets us in on her process of counterintuition as archival inquiry and interpretive strategy. She wants us, along with her, to resist familiar terms and maneuvers in visual culture, well-known approaches about photos of Black subjects in diasporic archives. She's no longer interested in image practices as, quote, sites of reproduction. Campt seeks out to assess other affective registers and quotidian image making and practices of survival. Her adept listening to the sonic frequencies of archives, of quotidian images, quotidian ID photos, makes glaring that such compulsory, compelled, and state-issued documents of Blacks are always multiply inflected and always subject to levels of scrutiny, a level of scrutiny projected and filtered through the photographic subject. the photographic subject, in the camera's frame for perhaps just a few brief seconds, must negotiate the spatio-temporal zone of photographic capture. Campt reveals that these sonic frequencies can be recorded, sonic frequencies that perhaps resist, speak beyond the Black imago, across centuries of geographic distance via the circumatlantic world system of Black subjugation and subject making. She also reveals how relational structure of the archive shapes her journey. She is not alone with photographic paper, documents, and films. She's always in company of others. At one point, a South African archivist plants a suggestion. Would you be interested in convict photos? She is not there at least looking for convict photos, but seeking them. Then there's her encounter with a Dutch tourist voyeur watching her in a Chelsea gallery. As Campt thinks through and across the connections between an earlier set of images, ethnographic photos of African women, and the photographs of Black sculptural hair on the walls of the gallery, where she experiences her own sort of ethnographic encounter. The voyeur does not so much see Campt as fetishizes her hair. Campt's presence heightens the sensory experience of the exhibition for the voyeur. Campt is part of the display. Her shocked consent, that is, what seems to be an unspoken moment when she actually finds herself posing for the Dutch woman, happens before Campt can muster words in response. Her body, however, has already staked a claim. It's taken a stance, a tension and stillness that Campt theorizes as stasis. But we know that later something has transpired, a negotiation of sorts with the Dutch woman to have a copy of the photograph of Campt and to archive that image here in dialogue with the ethnographic work. Or perhaps Campt's gift at this moment is to leave us wrestling with ambiguity between shock consent and stasis, the tension of refusal in the photographic capturing of Black women that rehearse ethnographic inquiry and typing. These relational encounters across archives and subject positions continue to guide her journey. Her husband comes along to assist her in a Cape Town archive and finds kinship in mugshots of Cape Town through convict photos, The hands of another mirroring his hands, the labeling of the other speaker speaks to ancestral classification and ethnic religious grouping. Hands appear here and elsewhere in the archives, as Campt just beautifully articulated. And the headless photos of the Gulu Real Art Studio, the hand of the Black Brixton labeled a pimp, Campt's hands guiding us not to only look, but to listen. The most disturbing hands, perhaps, Terrence Johnson, in desperate acts of survival, grabbing a gun not once, but twice. This is part of how I come to understand her use of haptic temporalities, how these hands reach across space and time, how we are gripped by them as we listen with more than our ears. The coda returns us to her home and to psychic relations between local archives and personal memory. Where is the mugshot of Terrence Johnson, that beautiful boy she so desperately wanted to save? How had the local police framed, identified, and serialized him? Can she hear sonic frequencies of refusal in his ID photo? She learns that the image doesn't exist, but one of his harrowing cries, his pleas for help, and the moans of sheer terror does. His cries in the photo are deafened by local news reportage, a $1 million bond, the city's negotiation with the police union. His cries are, to borrow from Christina Sharp, part of the weather. Is there a photo of his final encounter with the police? Johnson's last act is one of refusal by enacting Black premature death, perhaps. Was there a sound that emanated from his body before that self-inflicted wound to his flesh? Was it refusal, or had he succumbed to state violence, or both? I'm left wrestling with how to read and listen to Johnson here. Listening to images arrives at a critical moment, post-race, post-Brexit, post-Obama, and one shaped by resurgent white nationalism, border securitization, rape culture as sport, and other forms of quotidian and spectacular violence. What is the power of Black feminist grammar in an era of overt racist, misogynistic, xenophobic, anti-Semitic white nationalism as official state address? When the nation head uses words like "and" to implicate those victimized by white nationalist violence with their assaulters, who uses words like "or" as dog whistle to fuel the flames of white paranoia and the state violence of Minutemen, vigilantes, and Border Patrol, who pauses, allowed silence as a shout toward animus. Campt offers strategies for this 21st century moment through counterintuition by asking of photos what they were not intended to say or do. She finds answers elsewhere in quotidian practices of Black millennials on social media. About the Tumblr series, "If They Gunned Me Down, What Picture Would They Use?" Campt writes, refusing to wait passively for a future posited as highly likely or inevitable for Black urban youth, the sitters actively anticipate their premature deaths through these photos. In doing so, they enact anterior practices of fugitivity through their refusal to be silenced by the probability of a future violent death they confront on a daily basis. Campt insists that these practices of refusal as survival are examples of what is at stake in Black feminist grammar: the future real conditional, the political necessity of what will have had to happen. Campt likes the word "had" as must. She considers how these photos play on the affective tenors of respectability and swagger in their posturing. In her reading of these archives, I sense not quite something haptic, visual, or sonic, another call, another register, wildness, the wildness of Black feminist futurity, a map into unknown territory, with wildness meaning lack of discipline and restraint, what emanates from a composed body in a compelled photo that refuses composure, that emanates beyond the choice to comply or to refuse. To speak, enact, or listen to the future real conditional is to refuse disciplinary boundaries and institutional restraint. It is the wildness of Campt's imaginary world and scholarly brilliance that moves me through the various realms of listening to images into the must of an alternative future. Thank you.
So apparently I need to work on my bio. Check. Will do. All right, I'll just get set up here. Should I leave this open, Deb? Are you going to show images? They got you. Okay. All right. So the first thing I want to say is that it's really wonderful to be here celebrating Tina, who is such an amazing host for everybody else's work. And so thank you so much for this opportunity to think with you about your work, Tina. What I'm going to do, I think one of the ways in which one registers a book is, and registers what's amazing about it, is to say, wow, this has actually unpacked something for me in work that I'm trying to do and getting stuck in. So what I want to do today is suggest some of the ways in which you might apply the insights that Tina Campt has in this book to the various archives that she looks at, to some queer archives that really benefit from this sonic reading that she proposes. And the archives that I'm thinking about, I'll get to eventually after I tell you a little bit about what I'm pulling out of Tina's book. But I want to think about an archive of images that has something to do with what we might call low life. And low life is, you know, you know what low life means. I have a little quote that will help us out. Oh, here we go. There's even music, I think. We'll see in a minute. Low life, what? What happened here? I thought we were all looking at the same thing, but we weren't. What? problem with technology. Is there? Okay. All right. Well, we'll leave the images up. That's fine. Okay. So low life, of course, is people who are somehow not supposed to be in archives or escape the various technologies for recording life, or lives that are not worth recording, right? So let's see. I don't know if we have the music. Let's find out.
Your whole life, if they try to stem me, I go all out military. I'm camoed all out like I'm in the military. And free up all my niggas locked up in the penitentiary. Cause I'm always repping for that low life, repping for that low life. Low life, low life, low life. No, I'm repping for that low life. Yeah. Said I'm repping.
Don't worry, I'm not going to rap for the low life. I could. No, I won't. Okay, so over the summer, Tina and I both attended an event that was held in honor of Saidiya. And at that event, I presented some work about an anonymous black butch who was murdered in the 1970s, but appeared during what was probably a drug deal gone wrong, but was featured recently in the New York Times under the heading of Solved. And a journalist went on a quest to discover who this person was, how they had been killed, what had happened to their records, why the anonymous body had not been identified. One reason was that the body was read as male rather than being assigned female at birth. And the reporter was looking for a name to put to a face, a history around which to fashion a story. And what he actually found was something different. He found a series of factual dead ends, family members who could not be traced, connections that could not be explained according to our classifications of identities and practices and communities that were not only queer, but associated with what Future and Weekend are calling low life, which is why they, even in the police documentation designed to capture them, these kinds of images escape interpretation later on. And so when I read Tina's book, I was like, okay, damn, I should have read this book before I wrote that paper. So now I want to sort of go, that's the article. I want to return to the concept of low life at the end of my presentation. But I want to say now that having read Tina's amazing new book in which she counsels us to listen to images and instructs us in how to do so, I realize that her method offers mechanisms for reading these archives that I'm trying to trace, that I'm calling low life, of the nameless, the lost, and the misremembered. So the archives of people who can never appear within a historical record under the terms that they may have fashioned for themselves. And therefore, we have to listen closely to try to provide that lost context. So let me just lay out the intervention that the book makes and then try to use the book to think through some queer material that the book doesn't necessarily engage, but that it makes available for exactly these kinds of projects, okay? So I hope that's clear as a kind of setup. So there are numerous archives, and I think you got this from Tina's presentation and then Nicole's presentation as well. There are numerous archives in the book. They are not the same kind of archive. There are many, many different kinds of archives, and it's the way in which Tina brings these archives together that creates that hum, the low frequency that we're looking for in order to hear the stories that the photographs can't tell visually, and that they're finding, people within the photographs are finding other ways to say something about who they were. So this is the Ugandan Gulu Real Art Studio, a series of cutouts from African identity photographs where the face was cut out for a passport or an identification card, and the headless bodies were left as a ghastly reminder of the violence of identity. Right? This is what happens when one's forced into a certain form of identification. This image, this image in particular spoke to me. It's probably a little boy in his father's clothing, but it also suggests this mismatch between clothing, identity. We don't know the gender of this person. We don't know if it's a small person or a child. There's something completely unreadable, and this is why we have to change frequency. Then there's the Ernest Ice Collection that I think Tina worked with before, an archive of photographs in Birmingham, England, made up of photos and ephemera from a photographic studio in Balsall Heath, home to many Afro-Caribbean immigrants to England. The studio operated between 1940 and the early 1980s and almost inadvertently recorded this sort of arc of hope and disappointment of the Windrush generation. And you can see this drama playing out in some of the photographs gathered there. Then there's a Birmingham archive of photographs taken by Janet Mendelsohn, an American photographer, between 1966 and 1968, and placed in a photo essay, and you've got two of them here, these black and white photographs, that doesn't want to represent the community that she goes into in any kind of idealized way in order to, shape those people for citizenship or something, but in fact highlights, and you can see this in the image on the left, the ruined landscape of post-war Britain on the one hand, the informal economies that make up that ruined landscape, poverty and sex work. And so there are images of pimps and sex workers all played out against this backdrop of post-war Britain, not at all the place that the Windrush generation thought they were coming to, not least because of the grayness, the awfulness of the weather, the bleakness of the bombed out cities and so on. And then these other archives include a South African ethnographic photography project conducted by German-speaking missionaries in the late 19th century. This is, these German missionaries have been written about by other people like Fatima El-Taib as well, German colonialism in Southwest Africa, and the genocidal project of the Germans back in the 19th century in relationship to Black Africans. And then there's a South African photo album assembled by artist Santu Mofokeng entitled The Black Photo Album. These were images of Black South Africans from the early 20th century, some of them relatives of the artist, that he annotates and presents the images and wonders out loud whether the images offer this set of images of his relatives, do they offer evidence of internal colonization or challenges to it? And he himself is unable to read the photographs. Their message does not come to him clearly, despite some of these people being people that he knows. So it's this unreadability that requires that we switch to another way of interacting with the photograph, right? The visual is a deeply unstable, unreliable medium for some of the stories that the narrative, the photography is telling. And then, as we've heard, there was a prison album from South Africa, 1893. And there are more. There are multiple vernacular sources that she's using, including personal images, to assemble her own archive of mostly utilitarian images designed to capture life, a crime, a figure, an identity, a moment. The archives are very different, and they all bear different relationships to the law, crime, identification, citizenship, colonialism, racial fetishism, and objectification. But she gathers them together so that they speak with and through each other to offer viewers a sense of what the photographs whisper. And think of an artist like Popel, whose latest project is a whispering campaign. So in Documenta this year, you can walk through the galleries, and in the background, the African-American artist Popel is engaged in this constant whispering, and you cannot discern what is said, but you're asked through that whispering campaign to listen to the images as well as to see them. So let me tell you a few of what I take to be the most important arguments in this book. Many of the photo archives from the early 20th century that we might want to consult in order to make sense of Black, queer, or poor people's lives were compiled as part of the effort to police, survey, and manage the movements and the activities of these people. Campt calls these methods of representation technologies of capture, and that's why you have to break with them, because they were designed for other purposes than the way we might want to use them. She calls them this on account of the way that the photographs were meant to identify a body, but also place it in the hold of representation. And so she made the point that the images of the men in the prison will always be there, whether or not they are released from the jail. 2, the pictures are produced to manage Black lives, but also to silence them. Campt argues that the images she finds in various vernacular archives, passport photos, and ethnographic research, among others, hum with a quiet intensity that requires the viewer to listen. The sound that we register from the photographs, therefore, circulates on a lower frequency and can't be heard unless we develop certain reading practices attuned to feeling the presences and absences that the photograph records, right? So it's not just present absence in the visual, but in other registers as well. 3, the reading practices that Campt develops and offers her readers are tethered at one end to an elusive past that resides within and beyond the archives, and at the other end to a futurity, a Black feminist futurity, she tells us, that is both different and similar to the futures imagined in those photos. So photographs are, melancholic because they're always sort of looking forward to a future that you are now in, and it was probably not at all what people were hoping for. So it's that melancholic register as well that the photographs are operating at. The quiet frequency that if we hear it properly, we hear stories of refusal and fugitivity. The photographs, number 4, the photographs in these archives practice various forms of refusal. So let me show you how that works. Some, for example, the passport photographs demand mobility where stasis was required, right? So just getting a passport photo says, I am in motion. I'm not going to just stay here. I am not captive to this technology of citizenship. Others, say the South African prison photographs, refuse the anonymity that the mugshot bestows upon them, and there are nuances of expression that you can see in those photographs. When they're in just a grid like that, they seem to repeat each other. But once the hands are there, you have more to use in order to distinguish one person from the other. The men glower or sneer at the camera. They're forced to show their hands, and the hand images remind us of these other temporalities that the photo inadvertently includes. Haptic temporalities of touch, gesture, intimacy, crime, labor, grasping, reaching. The Varna Road photographs from Birmingham refuse respectability, refuse to arrange blackness for the future documentary historian in a way that confirms their suitability for citizenship. These images of sex workers and pimps, Campt tells us, record, quote, complex, intimate economies of sex and sex work, and register at the ambient frequency of quiet photography. All right, so by way of conclusion, and to return to my theme of low life then, I just want to talk, let me just take this amazing material that I have learned from reading Tina's book and apply it to some of these images that I found in an archive that I'm looking at in relationship to the trans male image. Now, here's the thing about a trans male image. It's not in an archive of trans men. It's randomly distributed across archives. So, for example, some years ago when I was looking for a tattoo, I was looking at all these British tattoo artists from the 1950s, and I came across this guy whose work I really love, and I thought of getting a tattoo by him, and I'd never seen a photograph of him with his shirt off. So then I see this photograph, I'm like, that's actually a trans chest. I don't know whether this person was born male or born female, but even when you see him with his clothes on, there's something that is trans about this particular tattoo artist. So this is how you find these kinds of images in an archive. There's no archive that's just like, here's a trans man from the 1950s who was also a tattoo artist, right? So I might be doing him a big disservice. So like those photographs with the heads off, I've taken his head off, which is on the one hand really violent, but on the other hand, I'm not saying what his name is. I don't know. Maybe he wasn't trans, but that looks to me like a trans chest. It does, and that's an amazing thing to think about, especially the boldness of displaying the chest with the bullfight upon it, the scene of masculinity. And he operated as a tattoo artist with other men in a shop in Portsmouth, and there's no record anywhere of him as a trans man. Okay, there are a few others. In the one archive in LA, I found one album of trans male photographs, and this is one of the philanthropists who gave a lot of money, which is why his papers are in the one archive. And along the way, I asked somebody, I said, well, why is the one archive, it's the biggest gay and lesbian repository of materials in North America, why is it called the one archive? And the archivist told me that the name comes from Carlyle, Thomas Carlyle, of all people. Not who I would have gone to. Okay? And this is the quote from Carlyle. A mystic bond of brotherhood makes all men one. A mystic bond of brotherhood makes all men one. The One Archives. Let's do that, right? So the One Archive is jammed with images of white gay men. But this guy, Reed Erickson, was a very wealthy trans man, and he gave money to the One Archive. So his file is in there. And he made an album of his own photographs called Eric Ego Trip, 20th Century. And he was born in 1917. There he is in 1962. He aged really well. And here's a picture of him bold, like the tattoo artist, with the shirt off, not hiding the fact that he does have breasts, but you've already decided he's male, Reed Erickson. And in fact, the gay men who were running the One Archive accepted his money and his photo album without realizing that he was a trans man. So it was never recorded in the archive as a trans archive, okay? So, and I just love these photographs. I just have to put this one in with the leopard. I don't know what to say. See Michael Jackson? I'm not sure. But to quote Nicole, there's something about the wildness of that particular image. Just sitting there, gently rubbing the neck of a cheetah or something is sort of extraordinary. And then he's often in photographs with a series of wives who all look like Marilyn Monroe. Okay. So let me conclude then. And he's obviously not the lowlife, but there's a way in which that lower frequency that we're looking at allows us to read some of these images along the same frequency. It gives us a different way of pairing things, bringing things together that don't otherwise belong together. So telling the story, and this is, there he is again, but here's my final image. So using Campt's notion of lower frequencies, as in the images from Varner Road, the hum with the rhythms of so-called low life, we can read more now into this mugshot, a technology of capture used by the police to imprison J. Doe, or AC as they were known, but one that fails. For a start, AC read as male in her mugshot and therefore was untraceable later on when the New York Times reporter tried to narrate their life and death. Second, AC looked straight at the camera, challenging all attempts made to still their identity, their movements, their embodiment. AC lived and died in the embrace of a low life that was violent and joyful, treacherous and companionable, hard and seductive. The tattoo artist died with the secret of his gender intact, having made indelible contributions to the street life of masculinity. And Reed Erickson, vibrating at a somewhat higher frequency, nonetheless is reduced to silence in the archive in which he appears. Telling the story of what's been dismissed by history as a low life requires that we listen to what artist Pope L has recently created as a whispering campaign, and to what Tina Campt so eloquently terms, quote, the haptic temporalities through which quiet photographs also register. This is an invaluable method, as I hope I have shown, for all kinds of accidental archives across which is strewn the records of lives lived on the down low, at a low volume, and in the quiet space of a discourse that will never be, capital H, history.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for having me here to join in the celebration for Tina's book during Tina's birthday week. I'm very happy to be at the table with my co-panelists. So I'm going to do something maybe a little bit different. I'm going to start, and you all are going to join in. Yeah? Okay. hear you. Listening to images is a love letter, an extended profession of tenderness for the material evidence of Black life. It is, as Tina states, an embodied encounter with the visual archive of diaspora, a call to destabilizing the singularity of our sensual orientation toward the visual field. To look or to watch, she writes, is to apprehend at only one sensory level. Listening requires an attunement to sonic frequencies of affect and impact. It is an ensemble of seeing, feeling, being affected, contacted, and moved beyond the distance of sight and observer. If the visual has been the handmaiden of the West's will to know, its categorization and simultaneous terrorization of the rest, then what is key to Tina's destabilization of this relation is empathetic attention to the quiet, quotidian, and affective resonances of portraiture. These resonances are unstable and unintentional, or perhaps it's better to say that they are often unconsciously intentional. They are insistent, but this is something I'll return to in a moment. I've used the word portraiture to encompass Tina's material objects, but they're more commonly understood as surveillance strategies of governance, quote, privileged vehicles of veracity and authentication, as she states. These are negations of the sovereignty of the subject toward the realization of the sovereignty of the nation state, the empire, the normative systems of authority that obtain within a global context of white supremacy. To see these images as portraits rather than mugshots of one kind or another, to hear their quiet insistence, is to work ethnographically, as Tina does. By this, I mean to evoke a method rather than a product or a perspective, one as it is practiced in the 21st century, rather than as it was mobilized during the 19th. What Tina does with the archives she mines is to walk alongside the subjects who appear within them in order to honor the everyday mattering of their lives, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. That which is inside the frame leads her to explore that which is beyond it. Whose blazer or tie or purse is that? What happened before or just after the image was captured? What are the webs of relation into which these individuals are enfolded? And what are the changing and often incoherent regimes of segregation being evoked, the forms of self-fashioning being realized, the desires for something more, something different, something meaningful, something useful, something else? It is this something else-icality that drives the aspirational tone of both the images themselves and Tina's analysis of them. To what does listening to images aspire? It attends to the, quote, infraordinary and the quotidian, end quote, in order to bring the unrecognized forms of Black futurity into view. This is a critical task and a radical one, given the current conjuncture. Its radicality exists not in the spectacularity of revolution, but in the everyday strategies of ordinary people, the opportunities taken and missed, the boredom of regular chores that have otherwise been timeless snapshots of ethnological example. Locating Black subjectivity in the realm of the humdrum everyday is, of course, itself a feminist repudiation of the vanguardist dreams that so often fuel revolutionary desires for social change. This is what Tina calls refusal. It is a complex interplay of suspension, liminality, and balance that allows us to identify, in her words, a politics of prefiguration that involves living the future now, as imperative rather than subjunctive, as a striving for the future you want to see right now in the present. These quotidian practices of refusal, she argues, do not typically read as movements, and they are not often legible as mobilizations. They are not potential, they just are. Refusal for Tina is a practice rather than an event. It is a creative, nimble, and ultimately unpredictable modality through which her subjects are, quote, refusing the terms of negation and dispossession, rebuffing the reduction of their lives to pathology. For me, Tina's refusal evokes Edouard Glissant's notion of opacity, a strategic disengagement with Western imperial knowledge projects through which we become named. Look, a Negro. Look, an immigrant. Look, a prisoner. If the visual is always already tainted, then how do we perceive this quotidian radicality? Tina posits two conceptual rubrics in addition to refusal: quiet and stasis. From these, I propose two more: recognition and love. That all of these rubrics are embodied states should remind us of Tina's insistence that seeing requires not only looking, but also listening and feeling. A digression. We are lying in Shavasana. I begin to cry for what reason I cannot now remember. I feel her hand on my left arm. It stills me. I breathe into the weight of her hand long after it has been removed. The feeling of it returns to me in dark times. In that moment, I am recognized. The form of recognition Tina enacts throughout listening to images requires an affective engagement. This is not the recognition of Hegel, which could only entail one's apprehension as an object in the midst of other objects, so as to maintain a binary subject-object relation. Nor is it the intersubjective recognition built through psychoanalytic object relations. In both these cases, recognition is something to be given rather than felt. It is something due to a universal modern subject. Tina undermines this notion of recognition in her reformulation of seriality. Seriality, in the archives she mobilizes, serves to, quote, fracture and fragment the notion of a unified subject. Taking, for example, the album of convict photos she analyzes, seriality surprisingly disaggregates. It individuates and personifies the prisoners it seeks to capture. It differentiates not only the specificities and severity of their infractions, but also makes us look for the family resemblance. Here we see someone's son, someone's brother, someone's uncle, someone's father, someone's ancestor, potentially a diasporic kinsman. Seriality also disturbs the categorization effect of late 19th century anthropological images, like the Marion Hill photos, an effect that located stasis as an ontological condition in relation to modern Western European white subjects, masters of the universe, those upon whom the sun would never set. This is different from the stillness of walking alongside, the kind of ethnography Tina enacts. The affective recognition Tina gives us is instead akin to the embodied hapticality Fred Moten and Stefano Harney identify as, quote, the capacity to feel through others, for others to feel through you, for you to feel them feeling you. It is a recognition grounded in the elaboration of archives as contact zones that touch us, that demand response and responsibility. This recognition does not stick to one time zone, but seeks to link past, present, and future in a relation not only to the production and reception of the images themselves, but also vis-a-vis their aspirational registers. This recognition fuels love. This is not love as a private affair, the eros Zizek disdains as impatient, intolerant, and violent. Nor is it the love of imperial control and liberal development, the claims to improvement and holds on populations as objects. It is instead Fanon's yes to life, yes to love, yes to generosity. It's what he called authentic love, that form of legitimating recognition, that wishing for others what one postulates for oneself. This is an insistent love, but not one that tallies accounts. Earlier, I showed you images of Black school children. Many of them were in schoolhouses in the segregated US South. Others were in segregated schoolhouses in South Africa. Still others were in makeshift schoolhouses in Jamaica or Nigeria. Others were not in schoolhouses at all. In some of the images, our gaze is returned, searchingly, gleefully, suspiciously. In others, it is refused. For me, the seriality of these images registers at a frequency of expectation, specifically an expectation of life, of the future, of care. It is the insistence on these expectations that creates the persistent hum of personhood, occasionally interrupted, obviously or obliquely, but ongoing nonetheless. It is love that brings these expectations into being. Or, to put this in Tina's tense, love is what will have had to happen to recognize these experiences. Real love, what John Jackson would call opaque, interiorized, nervous, dark, sincere love, one that takes risks, that takes for granted the contingency and partiality of knowledge of both others and self, and still manages to envision and enact futures in the present. We may run, but more often we dance. A last digression. We are at a bar and there is music playing. The location is immaterial. It could be Durham, it could be New York, it could be Kingston or Philly or London or Cape Town. We are dancing, we're sweating. We move in a parallax realm, individually and together. In this realm, we communicate with beings and things unseen. We exceed our physicality. We time travel. Our bodies are delivered into sound. In this realm, recognition is possible. Here, Tina shows us, we sense how, when, and why freedom can actually counteract the constraints of historical violence in the present. Here, we create conditions for love. Family, do you feel me?
Do you want to start with love? Because Tina came to my seminar just yesterday, and we were talking about love and hapticality. So it seems like that's a place.
It's interesting because some of the folks, some of the graduate students who were in that class are here, and now I'm feeling a little bit modest because the references to one of the things we were talking about was the relationship between my notion of the haptic and Fred and Stefano's notion of hapticality, and hapticality as love. And one of the things I explicitly said is that I can't get to love, that I'm not there yet. But one of the things I just learned from your presentation, Deborah, is maybe I do get to love. Get us to love. but also one of the things that you do is you give the conditions of the anteriority that I aspire to, right? So what will have had to have happened is the capacity to feel for and with the other, right? And yes, I think that that is the condition and at the same time, I felt too shy to say it. So I'm really grateful. I'm really grateful to everybody's responses